The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate stretch of Route 46. I was behind the wheel of my dusty old Jeep, heading to my cousin Dale's cabin near the outskirts of Deadwood Forest. Dale had always been the adventurous type, and his stories about the woods, stories of strange sightings and unexplained noises, never failed to send a chill down my spine. Still, he insisted I come out for the weekend, promising some much-needed R&R. The drive was uneventful at first, just miles of dense trees flanking the road. As the night crept in, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind carried faint whispers, the rustling of leaves sounded almost intentional, and every now and then my headlights caught the fleeting glint of animal eyes. I told myself it was just wildlife, nothing unusual for a remote area like this. I reached the cabin around 8 p.m. Dale greeted me with his trademark grin, his brown eyes sparkling beneath a mop of unruly hair. "Took you long enough," he teased, handing me a cold beer. The cabin was exactly what you'd expect, rustic, with creaky floorboards and walls adorned with deer antlers. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering light that danced across the room. Dale had prepared a hearty dinner, and as we ate, he launched into his usual tall tales about the forest. "You ever heard of the Dogman?" he asked, leaning forward with a conspiratorial grin. I rolled my eyes. "Seriously, Dale? You've been watching too many late-night documentaries." He laughed, but didn't back down. "I'm not joking, Ethan. People around here have seen it. A huge, wolf-like creature that walks on two legs, stands taller than a man, with glowing eyes and a scream that chills your soul. They say it's been around these woods for decades." I chuckled nervously, brushing it off. "Sounds like a local legend to keep tourists away." "Maybe," Dale said, his tone suddenly serious. "But you'll think twice when you hear it for yourself." I didn't sleep well that night. The forest outside seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. The creaks of the cabin and the occasional distant howl kept me tossing and turning until dawn. The next morning, Dale suggested a hike to a nearby clearing he called Whispering Pines. I reluctantly agreed, hoping some fresh air and exercise would help shake off the unease lingering from last night's conversation. The trail was rugged, winding through dense underbrush and towering trees. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As we walked, Dale pointed out tracks in the dirt, deer, raccoon, and something else, something bigger. "Look at this," he said, crouching near a cluster of prints. The tracks were enormous, resembling a canine's butt, with claw marks that dug deep into the soil. "Probably a bear," I said, though even I didn't believe it. Dale shot me a skeptical look, but didn't argue. We pressed on, reaching the clearing by midday. It was beautiful, a tranquil spot with a small pond and a ring of ancient pines. But even in the daylight, there was an unsettling vibe. The trees seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches almost touching, as if they were conspiring against the open sky. We spent the afternoon fishing and relaxing, but as the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer, and an oppressive silence settled over the clearing. "I think we should head back," I said, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. Dale nodded, unusually quiet. We packed up and started the trek back, but something felt off. The forest seemed different. The trail we had followed so easily earlier now felt foreign, as if the woods were deliberately trying to confuse us. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at the sky. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that froze us in our tracks. It was close, too close. Dale grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The growl came again, this time accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were too loud to belong to any ordinary animal. We scanned the trees, and that's when I saw it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes staring at us from the darkness. They were set too high off the ground, at least 7 or 8 feet up. My breath caught in my throat as the creature stepped into the faint light filtering through the trees. It was massive, its body covered in coarse, dark fur. Its head was unmistakably canine, with a long snout and sharp, bared teeth. But what froze me in terror was the way it stood, upright, like a man. Its muscular arms hung at its sides, each hand ending in long, razor-sharp claws. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Dale whispered, "Run!" We bolted, crashing through the underbrush like panicked deer. The thing let out a blood-curdling howl that echoed through the forest, and I knew it was chasing us. I could hear its heavy breathing, the snap of branches as it gained on us. Dale and I veered off the trail, hoping to lose it in the dense thicket. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the adrenaline kept me going. I could feel its presence behind me, a relentless shadow that refused to let up. We stumbled into a small ravine, the sudden drop catching us off guard. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ankle. Dale helped me up, his face a mask of fear. "We've got to keep moving," he urged, but it was too late. The creature stood at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Its glowing eyes locked onto us as it let out a low, menacing growl. Dale picked up a large branch, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice trembling. To our astonishment, the creature hesitated, tilting its head as if it understood. For a moment, there was an almost human intelligence in its gaze. Then it lunged. Dale swung the branch, landing a solid hit on its side. The creature snarled in pain, but didn't retreat. I grabbed a rock, hurling it with all my strength. It struck the creature's head, and for a split second, it stumbled. That was all the time we needed. We scrambled up the other side of the ravine, not daring to look back. The howls followed us all the way to the cabin. Back inside, we barricaded the doors and windows, our hearts racing. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of movement, snapping branches, growls, and those haunting howls. We spent the night huddled in the living room, clutching makeshift weapons and praying for dawn. The creature never breached the cabin, but its presence was palpable. Every so often we'd hear it scratching at the walls or pacing on the porch. When morning finally came, the forest was silent again. We ventured outside cautiously, finding deep claw marks gouged into the wooden door and strange, muddy prints circling the cabin. Dale and I packed up and left that day, swearing never to return. We didn't speak much on the drive back, the weight of what we'd experienced hanging heavy in the air. To this day, I can't explain what we saw, but I know this. The stories about the Dogman aren't just local legends. Something is out there, lurking in the shadows of Deadwood Forest, and it's not something you want to encounter. It started like any other Friday night, me scrolling through my laptop, looking for a cheap coffee table on Craigslist. My wife, Clara, had been pestering me for weeks to replace the wobbly one in our living room. We had just moved into our new house in rural Indiana, and money was tight. I figured a quick search would save us a trip to the furniture store. The listing caught my eye immediately. Antique coffee table, $25 OBO. The photo showed a sturdy, ornate wooden table with detailed carvings on the legs. It was way too nice for that price. Suspicious? Yes. But I couldn't resist a bargain. The seller, someone named Eddie, had left a phone number. I shot him a quick text. "Is the coffee table still available?" The response came almost instantly. "Yes, Can you pick it up tonight? $20 if you get it now. $20 for that? Too good to be true. But I was already imagining how pleased Clara would be, so I agreed. Eddie sent me the address and I grabbed my keys. The house was about 30 minutes away, tucked deep into the woods at the end of a narrow dirt road. As I pulled up, I could feel the unease creeping in. The property was a dilapidated farmhouse, its paint peeling and windows dark. The only sign of life was a faint glow from a porch light. I stepped out of my car, the crunch of gravel under my boots echoing in the stillness. Before I could knock, the door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and piercing blue eyes. He wore a flannel shirt that hung loosely on his frame, as if he'd missed a few too many meals. "You must be here for the table," he said, his voice rough and quiet. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm Ethan. Thanks for holding it for me." He didn't respond, just turned and gestured for me to follow. The interior of the house was worse than the outside, dimly lit, with an overwhelming smell of mildew. Piles of newspapers covered the floor, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Eddie led me to a small room in the back. There it was, the coffee table from the photo. It looked even better in person, its wood polished and carvings intricate. But something about it felt off. $20, Eddie said, leaning against the doorframe. His eyes never left me, watching intently as I reached for my wallet. "Here," I said, handing him a 20. "Thanks." He didn't say anything, just took the money and walked away. I hauled the table out to my car as quickly as I could, eager to get away from that place. By the time I got home, it was past midnight. Clara was already asleep, so I left the table in the living room and headed to bed. The first sign something was wrong came the next morning. Clara found me in the kitchen, her face pale. "Ethan, did you hear anything last night?" "No," I said, frowning. "Why?" She hesitated, glancing back toward the living room. "I heard footsteps. Thought it was you, but when I checked, you were asleep, and I swear I saw someone standing by the coffee table." I laughed it off, joking that she'd been dreaming. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I stayed up late watching TV. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, the soft creak of floorboards coming from the living room. My heart raced as I muted the TV and strained to listen. The sound grew louder, steady, like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the noise. When I reached the living room, it was empty, but the coffee table, it had moved. I know how that sounds. It wasn't much, just a few inches closer to the couch, but I was certain it hadn't been there before. "Clara?" I called, hoping she'd come out and laugh at me for being paranoid. No answer. I nudged the table back into place and went to bed, telling myself I was imagining things. The following nights were worse. The footsteps became more frequent, louder, and now they were accompanied by faint whispers. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but as the nights wore on, they became clearer. "Leave! Take it back!" The voice was low, almost a growl, and it sent shivers down my spine. Clara was terrified, begging me to get rid of the table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on, something I needed to understand. I decided to call Eddie. The phone rang endlessly before going to voicemail. Frustrated, I drove back to the farmhouse, determined to get some answers. When I arrived, the house looked even more decrepit, as if it had aged decades in the few days since I'd been there. The porch light was off, and the front door hung open, creaking in the wind. "Eddie?" I called, stepping inside. The air was heavy, suffocating. The living room was empty, save for a few broken chairs and a dusty mirror. I ventured deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. In the back room where the table had been, I found a stack of old photographs. They were black and white, faded, but one caught my eye, a picture of Eddie, much younger, standing next to the coffee table. Beside him was an older man with hollow eyes and a menacing grin. I flipped the photo over. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Do not keep it, it belongs to him." A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed the photo and bolted out of the house, desperate to get away. That night, the whispers turned into screams. Clara and I huddled in our bedroom as the sound of crashing furniture echoed through the house. The air grew cold, our breaths visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. Then it stopped. Silence. I mustered the courage to check the living room. The coffee table was gone, or so I thought. The next morning, we found it in the yard, its carvings warped and twisted, as if the wood itself had been screaming. Clara refused to step foot in the house until I got rid of it. I drove it back to Eddie's farmhouse, dumping it on the porch before speeding away. When I got home, I felt a weight lift, the oppressive atmosphere finally gone. We never heard from Eddie again. A few weeks later, I drove past the farmhouse, only to find it abandoned and overgrown. It was a Friday night when my friend Eric called me out of the blue. "Jay," he said, his voice tinged with excitement, "you're not going to believe this. I found a cabin deep in the Rockies on a rental app. It's dirt cheap and we can have it all to ourselves this weekend. A perfect escape from city life." I hesitated. The thought of spending the weekend in the wilderness didn't exactly appeal to me, but Eric's enthusiasm was infectious. "Fine," I said with a sigh. "But you're buying the food." The next morning, Eric pulled up in his old Jeep. The drive took hours, winding through narrow mountain roads, the dense forest swallowing the light as we climbed higher. When we finally reached the cabin, it looked rustic but cozy, a small structure nestled between towering pines, with a wraparound porch and a stone fireplace. The place was secluded. Too secluded, I realized as we unpacked the car. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. "Think of it as a detox," Eric said, patting my back. The first day was uneventful. We hiked a nearby trail, grilled burgers on the porch, and sat by the fireplace, talking about work and life. It wasn't until late that night that things began to feel strange. I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, like claws dragging across wood. I glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. "Eric!" I called, but there was no response. I got up and peeked out the window. The porch was empty, the forest beyond shrouded in darkness. "Probably a raccoon," I muttered to myself, climbing back into bed. The scratching stopped, but the unease lingered. The next morning, Eric was unusually quiet. When I asked if he'd heard anything during the night, he just shrugged. "It's the woods, man. Probably an animal." We decided to explore another trail, but something about the forest felt different that day, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. Then we found the prints. They were massive, larger than any animal I could think of, and the shape was wrong. Not a bear or a wolf. The tracks had long, clawed toes, and they followed no clear pattern, as if the creature had been circling aimlessly. "Maybe it's a prank," Eric suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We returned to the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It came from the porch, then the walls, then the roof. Eric grabbed a flashlight and yanked open the front door. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty woods. "See, just your imagination," he said, though his voice wavered. But as he closed the door, I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes watching from the tree line. The next morning, we decided to leave early, but the Jeep wouldn't start. Eric checked under the hood and cursed. "The battery's dead. I don't get it. It was fine yesterday." We were stranded. With no cell service and no way to call for help, we spent the day chopping firewood and trying to distract ourselves. But the tension was palpable. Every now and then, I caught Eric glancing toward the forest, his jaw tight. That night, the howling began. It wasn't like any howl I'd ever heard, not a wolf, not a coyote. It was guttural, almost human, and it sent shivers down my spine. Eric and I barricaded the door with furniture and sat by the fireplace, clutching the kitchen knives we'd brought for cooking. The howling grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the cabin. Then came the banging, something massive throwing itself against the walls. "Do you see it?" Eric whispered, his face pale. I peeked out the window and froze. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with a hunched frame covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its mouth was full of jagged teeth. It looked like a wolf, but its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long, its hands disturbingly human. The creature let out a low growl and slammed its claws against the glass. We spent the night in terror, the creature circling the cabin, growling and scratching. It didn't leave until dawn. When we finally stepped outside, the porch was destroyed. Deep claw marks marred the walls, and the tracks we'd seen in the forest were everywhere. Eric and I didn't speak as we gathered our things and started walking down the mountain. We didn't stop until we reached a small gas station on the outskirts of the forest. The attendant raised an eyebrow as we stumbled in, disheveled and shaken. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. "Not a ghost," Eric muttered. "Something worse." The attendant's smile faltered. "You were up in those woods, weren't you?" We nodded. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "People around here talk about a creature, a dogman, they call it. Most folks think it's just a legend, but you're not the first to come back with a story like that." Eric and I never spoke of the incident again. I don't know what we saw that night, but one thing's for sure. I'll never step foot in those woods again. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. To me, those stories were just tales people told to entertain or scare each other. But that was before the Hollowbrook Motel. It started as a simple road trip. My younger sister, Emma, and I were driving from Dallas to Denver to visit family. We left late, thinking we'd stop somewhere along the way to rest. By the time we hit the halfway point, it was already past midnight, and exhaustion was setting in. We passed a sign for Hollowbrook Motel, an older roadside inn that looked like it hadn't seen renovation since the 70s. The neon sign flickered, one of the O's in motel completely burned out. "Should we keep driving?" Emma asked, eyeing the building nervously. "We're too tired," I said, pulling into the lot. "It's just one night." The check-in desk was manned by an elderly woman with thin glasses perched on her nose. Her expression was flat, almost as if she were bored with the very idea of us being there. "Room for 2?" she asked, her voice monotone. "Yes, please," I said. She slid a rusty key across the counter, her hand trembling slightly. "Room 7, upstairs." As we climbed the creaky wooden stairs, Emma whispered, "I've got a bad feeling about this place." "You've watched too many horror movies," I teased, though I couldn't shake the unease creeping in. Room 7 was small and musty, with outdated floral wallpaper and a single, flickering lamp. The bedspread looked clean enough, but the carpet was threadbare and stained. Emma wrinkled her nose. I don't even want to know what's in the bathroom. Just one night, I reminded her, setting my bag on the bed. As I turned to close the door, I noticed something odd. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The first sign something was wrong came around 2 a.m. I woke up to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was Emma talking in her sleep, but when I looked over, she was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. The whispers were faint, just beyond the range of comprehension, but they were definitely there. I got up and opened the door to the hallway. It was empty, the whispers louder now, but still impossible to make out. They seemed to come from every direction at once. "Close it," Emma hissed. "Please, just close it." I shut the door and locked it, my heart pounding. The next morning, we decided to leave early. But when I went to the front desk to check out, the old woman was gone. In her place was a man who looked just as worn down as the motel itself. "Did the woman from last night leave?" I asked. He frowned. "There's no woman here. I run this place alone." I felt a chill run down my spine. "She checked us in last night." He shook his head. "I don't know who you saw, but it wasn't me." As we drove away, Emma confessed she'd seen something in the room the night before. "It was in the mirror," she said, her voice trembling. "A face. Not yours or mine. It was just watching." I tried to brush it off, blaming it on exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. That night, back on the road, we stopped at a diner for dinner. As we sat down, Emma's face went pale. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed to the far corner of the diner. Sitting there, staring right at us, was the old woman from the motel. Working nights has always been tough, but the pay was decent, and I had no other options at the time. The job was at a large, outdated warehouse on the outskirts of town. I was hired as a security guard, tasked with patrolling the facility and ensuring no one broke in. It sounded simple enough. The warehouse itself was a relic from the 1950s, with towering shelves stacked high with old machinery, crates and files. The air smelled of dust and rust, and the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. I worked alone, except for a small office where a supervisor, Roger, stayed until midnight before leaving me to finish the shift. "This place has a reputation," Roger warned on my first day. "People say it's haunted, but it's just stories. Don't let it get to you." I laughed it off, chalking it up to local superstition. I should have listened. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time walking the aisles with a flashlight, jotting notes on my clipboard. Occasionally, I'd hear the creak of settling metal or the scurry of a rat, but nothing unusual. Then came Friday night. I was patrolling the back section of the warehouse, an area we called the Vault, because of how isolated it was. The crates here were covered in tarps, their contents long forgotten. As I walked, I noticed something odd, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and steady. It was coming from deeper in the vault. "Probably a loose pipe," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But as I moved closer, the tapping stopped abruptly. The silence was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I turned, shining my flashlight behind me, and froze. A shadow moved across the wall, not mine, not anything nearby. It was tall, impossibly thin, and it darted out of sight before I could fully process it. By the time I returned to the office, my hands were trembling. I debated calling Roger, but decided against it. He'd probably laugh and tell me it was just my imagination. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next week, things escalated. I was doing my usual rounds when I heard the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. They were deliberate, heavier than my own, and they seemed to follow me no matter which aisle I turned down. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. No answer. The footsteps stopped suddenly and I felt a cold draft sweep past me, though there were no windows or open doors. I turned the corner and saw it again. The shadow. This time it lingered at the far end of the aisle, as if watching me. "Stay back!" I shouted, holding up my flashlight. The beam hit the wall, but the shadow didn't react. It remained still for a moment before melting into the darkness. That night, I reviewed the security footage in the office. At first, everything seemed normal. But then I saw it. A dark figure moving through the aisles, its form flickering like a faulty projection. It wasn't human. The following night, Roger decided to stay late after I told him what I'd seen. He was skeptical, but agreed to join me on my rounds. As we walked through the warehouse, he joked about how I was letting the place get to me. But then we reached the vault. The tapping sound started again, louder this time. Roger's laughter died in his throat. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Before I could answer, the shadow appeared. It moved along the walls, circling us, growing larger and darker with each pass. Roger panicked, dropping his flashlight. "We need to get out of here!" he shouted, running back toward the office. I followed, but not before glancing back one last time. The shadow had stopped moving, standing still in the middle of the aisle. Its face, if you could call it that, was a void, black, featureless, and staring right at me. Roger quit the next day, leaving me to work alone again. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, but the shadow wasn't done with me. Each night, it became bolder, appearing closer and closer. It would knock over crates, whisper unintelligible words, and once it even grabbed my arm. The sensation was icy and numbing, like being submerged in freezing water. The final straw came 2 weeks later. I was patrolling the vault when I heard a loud crash. I ran toward the sound and found one of the massive shelves toppled over, its contents strewn across the floor. Standing in the middle of the mess was the shadow. This time, it didn't disappear. It advanced toward me, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. I bolted for the exit, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air. I quit the next morning. The manager tried to get me to stay, offering a raise, but no amount of money was worth facing whatever was in that warehouse. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I'll never work the night shift again. I got the call late one evening. My friend Martin had been working the night shift at a small manufacturing plant outside of town. He sounded frantic, his voice shaky and uneven. "You've got to come," he said. "Something's not right here." Martin wasn't one to scare easily, so his tone immediately set me on edge. He refused to give me details over the phone, only repeating, "Just get here, please." I grabbed my jacket and drove the 15 minutes to the plant. The building stood alone on the edge of a wooded area, its brick facade cracked and faded. The parking lot was nearly empty except for Martin's car and an old van. When I walked into the plant, the air was thick with the smell of grease and metal. Machines stood idle in rows, their hulking forms casting strange shadows in the dim lighting. Martin met me near the back of the floor. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the far corner of the room. "What's going on?" I asked. "You won't believe me," he whispered. "Try me." He hesitated, then pointed to a door at the far end of the plant. It was unmarked, its paint peeling. "There's something behind that door," he said. "Something wrong." I followed him across the factory floor, my footsteps echoing against the concrete. The closer we got to the door, the heavier the air seemed to become. "When did you first notice it?" I asked. "About a week ago," he said. "I heard noises coming from inside, scratching, shuffling. At first, I thought it was just rats or maybe someone messing around. But then..." He trailed off, his voice trembling. "But then what?" Martin stopped in front of the door and handed me a flashlight. "See for yourself." I opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Beyond it was a narrow staircase leading downward. "This was supposed to be a storage room," Martin explained. "But it doesn't feel like that. It feels ancient." I descended the stairs, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and an earthy, metallic scent filled my nose. At the bottom of the staircase was a large open room. The walls were made of rough stone, as if they had been carved out of the earth itself. In the center of the room was a large, circular symbol, etched into the floor and filled with what looked like dried blood. Surrounding the circle were candles, some burned down to stubs, others freshly lit. "What is this?" I muttered, stepping closer. "I told you," Martin said from the top of the stairs. "Something's wrong here." As I inspected the room, I noticed strange carvings on the walls, symbols and shapes that seemed to shift if I stared at them for too long. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the room was plunged into darkness. When the beam steadied, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In one corner of the room there was a pile of objects, animal bones, bits of fabric, and what looked like old photographs. I picked up one of the photos and froze. It was a picture of Martin. "Martin!" I called, my voice echoing up the staircase. He appeared at the top, his face pale. "What is it?" I held up the photo. "Why is this down here?" He stared at it, his expression shifting from confusion to terror. "I don't know," he stammered. "I've never been down there before tonight." I looked around the room again and noticed something else. Footprints in the dust. They didn't lead to the staircase, but instead stopped abruptly in the middle of the circle. I stepped back, my heart racing. "We need to leave." Martin nodded, and we hurried up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind us. But the moment we stepped onto the factory floor, the machines began to hum. "Did you turn those on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," Martin said, his eyes wide. One by one, the machines roared to life, their gears turning and belts spinning. But there was no one operating them. The sound was deafening, and the lights overhead began to flicker violently. Then, amidst the chaos, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the direction of the door we had just closed. I turned, and my blood ran cold. The door was open again, and standing in the doorway was a figure. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its face obscured, but its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed a sickly yellow. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Martin's arm. We sprinted toward the exit, the sound of heavy footsteps behind us. It felt like the figure was right on our heels, its presence oppressive and suffocating. We burst into the parking lot and jumped into my car, locking the doors. "Drive!" Martin screamed, and I floored the gas pedal. As we sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the middle of the lot, watching us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. When we finally stopped at a gas station miles away, Martin broke the silence. "What was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, my hands still shaking. "We never returned to the plant, and as far as I know it's still operating, but I'll never forget what we saw, or the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there." factory had been abandoned for decades, or so people claimed. Located at the edge of the industrial district, it was surrounded by chain, link fences and overgrown weeds. The place was a magnet for urban explorers, thrill seekers, and occasionally vagrants seeking shelter. But for me, it was work. I was hired by a property management company to oversee the cleanup and assess the building's condition before it was demolished. The pay was good, and I was no stranger to working alone in unsettling places. When I first walked in, the air felt heavy, as if the building itself resented my presence. The factory floor was vast, with rusted machines standing like forgotten monuments. Dust coated every surface, and the windows were so grime-covered that they barely let in any light. Still, it was just a building, or so I thought. The first few hours went smoothly. Armed with a flashlight and a clipboard, I made my way through the plant, taking notes on structural damage and potential hazards. Occasionally, I'd hear strange noises, creaks, thuds, the sound of something scraping across the floor. It's just the building settling, I told myself, though my unease grew with each sound. By late afternoon, I'd made it to the lower levels. This part of the factory was a labyrinth of hallways and storage rooms, some still filled with forgotten tools and equipment. It was in one of these rooms that I found something unusual, a set of footprints in the dust. They were fresh. My first thought was that someone else was in the building, maybe a squatter or another explorer. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. No response. The footprints led deeper into the factory, toward an area marked restricted access. The door was ajar, its hinges rusted and barely holding together. Against my better judgment, I followed. The room beyond was massive, with a high ceiling and walls lined with strange, archaic machinery. In the center was a large pit, surrounded by a metal railing. As I approached the edge, a chill ran down my spine. The pit wasn't empty, it was filled with water, murky and black, its surface unnaturally still. I shone my flashlight into the depths but couldn't see the bottom. A noise behind me made me whip around. There was no one there, but the door I had entered through was now closed. I swallowed hard and tried to focus on my task, jotting down notes about the machinery and the pit. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I saw it. At the far end of the room, something moved. It was quick, darting between the shadows, too fast for me to get a good look. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No answer. I decided I'd had enough. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pushed or pulled, it remained stuck. Panic set in as I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the room was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, I saw it. Standing at the edge of the pit was a figure. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and its skin was pale and translucent. But its face was wrong. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The figure didn't move, but the water in the pit began to ripple, as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then stepped into the pit. It sank slowly, its body disappearing into the black water without a sound. I didn't wait to see what happened next. Grabbing a metal pipe from the floor, I used it to pry the door open and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding. When I reached the surface, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the factory floor. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in fresh air. I called my supervisor and told him everything. He laughed, saying I must have let my imagination get the best of me. But the next day, he called me back, his tone serious. "Did you touch anything in that room?" he asked. "No," I said. "Why?" He hesitated. "The pit you described, we've had reports of it before, but it wasn't supposed to be there. That area was sealed off decades ago after an accident." "What kind of accident?" "A worker fell into a vat of chemicals," he said. "They never recovered the body. I never went back to the factory. A week later, I heard it was demolished. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the pit and the figure standing at its edge." When I took the night shift as a security guard at the old downtown parking garage, I thought it would be easy money. The place was barely used after dark, except for a handful of tenants who lived in the nearby apartments. The first week was uneventful. I'd patrol the levels, check for trespassers, and spend most of the night reading or scrolling through my phone. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, but I chalked it up to the late hours. But then things started to happen. It began with small noises, the sound of footsteps when no one was there, the faint echo of a door slamming on a floor I hadn't checked yet. At first, I thought it was my imagination or maybe just the structure settling, but the noises grew louder, more distinct. One night around 2 a.m., I was doing my usual patrol when I saw something strange on the third level. A car that hadn't been there before was parked near the far corner. It was an old sedan, its paint faded and peeling. The headlights were off, but the engine was running, the soft hum breaking the silence of the garage. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim light. "Security," I called out. "Is everything okay?" No response. As I got closer, I noticed the driver's seat was empty. The engine sputtered and died just as I reached the car. That's when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, there was a face staring back at me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The face disappeared, and when I opened the car door to check, the interior was empty. Shaken, I finished my patrol and spent the rest of the night in the security office, watching the cameras. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me. But the following night, things got worse. It was around the same time, 2 a.m., when I heard the elevator ding. The sound echoed through the garage, unnerving in its suddenness. I checked the cameras but didn't see anyone. Grabbing my flashlight, I headed toward the elevator to investigate. The doors were open when I arrived, the interior bathed in flickering fluorescent light. "Hello?" I called out. The doors began to close, but before they shut completely, I saw something move inside, a shadow, quick and deliberate. I pressed the call button, and the elevator doors reopened. The cab was empty. Feeling a chill crawl up my spine, I decided to head back to the security office. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me!" I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me!" I turned back toward the elevator, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The doors slammed shut and the elevator began to descend, even though no one had pressed the button. I ran back to the office, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing as I checked the cameras again. That's when I saw it. On the third level, near the corner where the old sedan had been parked, a figure was standing. It was tall and cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct, but its eyes, two pinpoints of glowing red light, burned through the grainy footage. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It just stood there, staring directly at the camera. I wanted to leave, to abandon the shift and never come back. But I was paralyzed, unable to look away from the screen. Then the power went out. The office was plunged into darkness, the hum of the monitors replaced by an oppressive silence. My flashlight was still on, but its beams seemed weaker, as if the darkness was swallowing the light. I could hear footsteps outside the office door, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft tapping on the glass. I turned the flashlight toward the office window and nearly dropped it. The figure was there, its face pressed against the glass. Its features were obscured, but its eyes burned with a malevolent intensity. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, backing away. The tapping stopped, and the figure dissolved into the shadows, as if it had never been there. The power came back on moments later, and I immediately called my supervisor, telling him I couldn't finish the shift. He wasn't happy, but I didn't care. I never went back to that garage. Later, I found out that the building had a dark history. Decades ago, a man had been killed in the elevator shaft. An accident, they said. But some of the older guards believed otherwise, claiming he'd been pushed by something unseen. Whatever the truth, I know what I experienced, and I'll never forget those glowing red eyes. I still regret saying yes to that job. It sounded simple at first, a week spent guarding an old cabin in the woods while the new owner decided what to do with it. The cabin had been abandoned for years and the place was falling apart. "Just make sure no squatters move in," the man on the phone had said. "And don't worry, we'll pay extra for the isolation." I wasn't thrilled about being alone in the middle of nowhere, but the money was good and I needed it. So I packed my gear and headed out. The drive was uneventful, but the cabin itself was unsettling. The structure was small, made of weathered wood that creaked with every gust of wind. The surrounding forest was dense, the trees towering over the cabin like silent sentinels. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of rot. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. A single kerosene lamp sat on the table, next to a stack of old newspapers. The first night passed without incident. I made a fire in the fireplace, cooked some instant noodles, and tried to ignore the eerie silence outside. It was on the second night that things began to change. I was sitting by the fire, reading one of the newspapers, when I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but the sound came again, louder this time. Grabbing my flashlight, I approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. I opened the door, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The forest was quiet, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But there was no one there. I closed the door, double, checking the lock, and went back to the fire. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the dusty sheets covering the furniture had been moved. I was sure I hadn't touched it, and yet it was crumpled on the floor, as if someone had yanked it off in a hurry. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to rationalize it. "The wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't really believe it. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the area. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I found footprints leading around the cabin. They weren't mine. The prints were deep, as if left by something heavy, and they circled the cabin several times before disappearing into the woods. I considered leaving, but the thought of the money kept me there. "It's just a week," I told myself. "I can handle this." I was wrong. That night, the knocking returned, but this time it was accompanied by whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I pressed my ear to the door, the whispers became clearer. "Let us in," they said, the voices overlapping in a sinister chorus. My heart pounded as I backed away from the door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they suddenly stopped. Then the door handle began to turn. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and stood frozen, my eyes locked on the door. The handle twisted violently, but the lock held. Finally, the noise stopped, and I heard footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind set my nerves on edge. The following day, I decided to investigate the cabin more thoroughly. In the small bedroom, I found a trap door hidden beneath an old rug. It led to a cellar. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The air that rose from the cellar was cold and damp, carrying the stench of decay. I shone my flashlight down and saw a set of wooden stairs leading into the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs was a small room, its walls lined with shelves filled with jars. The jars contained strange, unidentifiable objects, bones, dried herbs, and what looked like animal organs. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat an open book. The pages were covered in symbols and writing I couldn't understand. I felt a deep sense of unease, as if I were being watched. I slammed the trapdoor shut and decided to leave the cabin. But when I stepped outside, I froze. The forest was different. The trees seemed closer, their branches twisting unnaturally. The sky was overcast, the sun barely visible through the thick clouds. And then I saw them. Figures stood at the edge of the woods just beyond the tree line. They were tall and gaunt, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. I ran back inside, bolting the door and barricading it with furniture. The whispers returned that night, louder and more persistent. They came from every direction, as if the cabin itself was alive. "Let us in," they demanded. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and I knew something was about to happen. The fire in the fireplace roared to life, the flames rising unnaturally high. The room grew unbearably hot, and the walls seemed to close in around me. And then I saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a figure, taller than any human, its body twisted and grotesque. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. It didn't speak, but I could feel its intentions, malicious, predatory. I held up the iron poker, but it felt useless against whatever this thing was. The figure took a step toward me, and the room seemed to vibrate with its presence. Desperate, I grabbed the strange book from the cellar and hurled it into the fire. The flames consumed it instantly, and the figure let out an inhuman screech before vanishing into the darkness. When morning came, I didn't wait to collect my things. I drove away from that cabin as fast as I could, vowing never to return. Later, I learned that the cabin's previous owner had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some said he was a recluse dabbling in dark rituals, and that whatever he summoned never truly left. Never true. It all started with a dare. My friends and I had been talking about local legends, and the one about the bridge to nowhere came up. The bridge, they said, was cursed. Built decades ago over a now dry riverbed, it was abandoned before completion. No one knew why. Some said workers disappeared during construction. Others whispered about strange sightings. "I dare you to cross it," my friend Derek challenged, a mischievous grin on his face. It was supposed to be a joke, just a way to prove I wasn't scared. But as I stood at the edge of the crumbling structure that night, I realized this was no ordinary bridge. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive. The metal beams were rusted, and the wooden planks creaked under my weight. "It's just an old bridge," I muttered, trying to steady my nerves. My friends watched from a distance, their laughter echoing in the stillness. "Hurry up, man!" Derek shouted. Halfway across, I noticed something strange. The other side of the bridge, which should have led to a forest clearing, was shrouded in thick fog. And then I heard it, a faint sound, like whispers carried on the wind. "Did you hear that?" I called back to my friends. "Hear what?" Derek yelled, his voice tinged with annoyance. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't in any language I recognized, but the tone was clear, angry, demanding. "Turn back," they seemed to say. But I didn't. Not yet. The planks beneath me began to feel unsteady, as if they might give way at any moment. I froze, gripping the railing for support. That's when I saw them. Figures emerged from the fog, their shapes barely visible. They moved slowly, deliberately, and their eyes, their eyes, burned like dying embers. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figures didn't respond. They just stood there, watching. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but the bridge groaned under my weight, and I realized retreating might be just as dangerous. "Come on, man, stop messing around," Derek yelled again, his voice distant, almost muffled. The figures began to move, their forms becoming clearer. They weren't human, not entirely. Their bodies were elongated, their limbs impossibly thin. One of them raised a hand, pointing directly at me. A wave of cold washed over me, and I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the bridge itself was trying to drag me forward. "Guys, help!" I screamed, but when I turned to look at my friends, they were gone. The forest, the dirt path, even the stars above, all had vanished. I was alone, suspended in an endless void, with only the bridge and the figures in the fog. Panic set in and I started to run. The planks beneath me buckled and groaned, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get off that bridge. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices shouting in anger and pain. And then the bridge began to collapse. I jumped, landing hard on the ground below. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I didn't stop moving. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of splintering wood and crashing metal echoing behind me. When I finally dared to look back, the bridge was gone. Not collapsed, gone. The figures, however, were not. They stood at the edge of the void where the bridge had been, their burning eyes fixed on me. One of them stepped forward, its elongated arm reaching out. "Leave this place," it said, its voice a chilling blend of male and female tones. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran until I found the dirt road leading back to town. My friends were waiting there, their faces pale and filled with concern. "Where were you?" Derek demanded. "You were gone for hours." Hours? It had felt like minutes. I tried to explain, but they didn't believe me, not fully. Later, I did some research on the bridge. What I found chilled me to the bone. The workers who had disappeared during its construction had never been found, and some believed their restless spirits haunted the bridge. Others claimed the bridge was a gateway to another realm, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. Whatever the truth, I know one thing for certain. I'll never go near that cursed bridge again. The first time I heard about the Black Hound was from my grandfather. He used to tell stories about a spectral dog with glowing red eyes that roamed the countryside near our small town. "It's not just any dog," he'd warn. "It's a harbinger, a creature that brings death to those who cross its path." I always thought it was just an old man's tale, something to keep kids from wandering too far at night. But last summer, I learned the truth the hard way. I was staying at my uncle's farm for a few weeks, helping him out while he recovered from a leg injury. The farm was isolated, surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills, with the nearest neighbor miles away. One night, as I was finishing up the evening chores, I noticed something strange. The cows in the barn were restless, their eyes wide and fixed on the open door. "What's got them spooked?" I muttered, stepping outside to check. The air was unusually still, and the sky was clear, the full moon casting long shadows across the fields. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it might be a coyote or a stray dog. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the sound, but the beam only illuminated the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The growl came again, deeper and closer this time. My skin prickled as a pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, burning with an intensity that felt almost alive. The creature stepped into the moonlight, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a dog, but not like any dog I'd ever seen. Its fur was jet black, matted and wild, and it stood taller than any wolf. Its presence was oppressive, as if the air itself grew heavier with each step it took. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then it let out a bone, chilling howl that echoed through the night. I bolted for the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. My heart was pounding as I peeked through the window, but the creature was gone. The next morning, I told my uncle what I'd seen. He didn't laugh or dismiss it as my imagination. Instead, his face grew pale, and he reached for the cross hanging around his neck. "You saw the black hound," he said grimly. "That's a bad omen." He went on to explain that sightings of the black hound always preceded tragedy. "If it's come to our farm, we're in trouble," he said, his voice heavy with fear. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. Maybe I'd just been tired or mistaken, but the events of the next few days made that impossible. It started with small things: tools going missing, strange claw marks appearing on the barn doors, and the animals refusing to go near the woods. Then on the third night, the attacks began. I was jolted awake by the sound of barking and frantic mooing. Grabbing a flashlight and my uncle's old rifle, I ran outside. The sight that greeted me was horrifying. Several of the cows had broken out of their enclosure, their eyes wild with terror. In the center of the field stood the black hound, its eyes locked onto mine, and it let out a low growl, baring its razor-sharp teeth. I raised the rifle, aiming at the creature, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. Before I could fire, the hound lunged, its massive form moving with unnatural speed. I pulled the trigger, the sound of the shot ringing out across the field. The creature yelped and disappeared into the shadows, but I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, we found one of the cows dead near the woods, its body mangled beyond recognition. My uncle decided it was time to call in help. He contacted a local pastor who was known for performing blessings and exorcisms. When the pastor arrived, he took one look at the claw marks and the blood-stained field and nodded gravely. "This isn't just an animal," he said. "It's something much darker." The pastor spent the next few hours blessing the house, the barn, and the surrounding land. He placed crosses at every entrance and sprinkled holy water along the perimeter. That night, we stayed inside, the rifle loaded and ready by the door. The silence was unbearable, every creak and rustle setting my nerves on edge. And then, just past midnight, the howling began. It was louder than before, echoing from all directions as if the hound was everywhere at once. The windows rattled, and the lights flickered as the air grew thick with a suffocating presence. Suddenly, the front door slammed open despite the heavy locks and barricades. The black hound stood in the doorway, its eyes burning brighter than ever. The pastor stepped forward, holding a crucifix and chanting prayers in Latin. The creature snarled, but it didn't attack. Instead, it seemed to waver, its form flickering like a shadow caught between worlds. With one final prayer, the pastor raised the crucifix high and the hound let out a deafening howl before vanishing into the darkness. The next morning, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. The pastor warned us to remain cautious, saying the hound might return if the land wasn't properly sanctified. My uncle decided to sell the farm soon after, and I can't say I blamed him. To this day, I don't know exactly what the black hound was, a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: when you see those glowing red eyes, you run. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and unwind by the water. Lake Evermore, with its crystal clear surface and serene surroundings, seemed like the perfect retreat. My best friend Sarah had booked the cabin months ago, insisting we needed a break. It was an old, secluded property that overlooked the lake, nestled deep within the forest. The first day was idyllic. We spent hours kayaking, fishing, and soaking in the sun. By evening, we were sitting on the porch, sipping hot cocoa and listening to the gentle lapping of the waves.
"I heard there's a legend about this place," Sarah said suddenly, breaking the silence. I rolled my eyes. "Let me guess, a haunted lake?" she laughed. "Something like that. Apparently, people have seen a shadow moving across the water at night. They say it's the spirit of a fisherman who drowned here decades ago." "Creepy," I replied, though I didn't take her seriously. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling her story had left behind. The cabin was old, with creaky floorboards and windows that rattled in the wind.
The moonlight streaming through the curtains cast strange patterns on the walls, and every little sound seemed magnified in the stillness. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint splash coming from the direction of the lake. At first, I thought it might be a fish or a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was as if someone, or something, was wading through the water. Curiosity got the better of me, and I got out of bed to investigate. Peeking out of the window, I saw the lake shimmering under the moonlight, perfectly calm. But then, near the center of the lake, I noticed something odd. A dark shape was moving across the surface, almost like a shadow. It was hard to make out, but it seemed to be heading toward the shore. A chill ran down my spine. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. "What is it?"
"There's something on the lake," I said, my voice trembling. Her eyes snapped open and she sat up, immediately alert. "What are you talking about?" I pointed toward the window. "Look for yourself." We both stared out into the night, our breaths fogging up the glass. The shadow was still there, gliding closer to the shore. "What is that?" Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied. We stood frozen, watching as the shadow reached the edge of the lake and disappeared beneath the surface.
For a moment, everything was still. Then we heard it, the sound of wet footsteps approaching the cabin. "Did you lock the door?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah nodded, but she didn't look convinced. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a strange squelching noise, like someone dragging something heavy through the mud. Suddenly the doorknob rattled. We both gasped, retreating into the corner of the room. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. There was no response, just the relentless sound of the doorknob twisting and turning. I grabbed a lamp, clutching it tightly as if it could somehow protect us. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment we thought it was over. But then a loud bang echoed through the cabin as something heavy slammed against the door. The banging continued, each impact shaking the walls. "Call someone!" Sarah shouted, fumbling for her phone, but there was no signal and the landline was dead. "We have to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How? Whatever that thing is, it's right outside." I glanced toward the back door, which led to the forest. "We can sneak out the back and make a run for the car." Gathering every ounce of courage we had, we crept toward the back door. The banging on the front door had stopped, but the air felt thick with an unexplainable tension. As we stepped outside, the cold night air hit us like a slap. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves absent. We moved quickly but quietly, our eyes darting around for any sign of movement. And then we saw it. The shadow was back, but this time it wasn't on the lake. It was standing in the clearing ahead, its form dark and indistinct, as if it were made of smoke. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. The shadow began to shift, elongating and twisting as if it were trying to take shape. And then it started moving toward us. We ran, adrenaline fueling our every step. The shadow seemed to glide effortlessly, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. Reaching the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Hurry!" Sarah screamed, glancing over her shoulder. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas. As we sped down the dirt road, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the shadow standing at the edge of the forest, its red eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. The locals listened to our story with a mix of skepticism and fear. "You're lucky to be alive," one old man said. "Not everyone who sees the shadow on the lake makes it out." We never returned to Lake Evermore, and to this day I can't explain what we saw. All I know is that some places are better left undisturbed. The old McAllister textile mill had been abandoned for decades, sitting on the edge of town like a hulking monument to a forgotten era. Its towering smokestacks and shattered windows were a constant reminder of the factory's grim history, a fire that claimed the lives of over 50 workers one cold winter night in 1953. Despite the local legends surrounding the place, I never believed in ghosts or curses. So, when my friends, Ethan and Carla, suggested sneaking in for a night of urban exploration, I agreed without hesitation. We arrived just after sunset, armed with flashlights and a cheap camcorder to document our adventure. The factory loomed before us, its massive doors padlocked and chained. "Looks like they don't want anyone getting in," Ethan remarked, shaking the chain. "Or something getting out," Carla joked, her voice tinged with mock fear. We found a side window that had been pried open and climbed inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rust, and our footsteps echoed eerily in the cavernous space. The main floor was littered with debris, broken machinery, piles of rotting fabric, and scattered tools. Faded posters on the walls bore slogans like "Safety First" and "Pride in Every Stitch." "This place is a time capsule," Carla said, shining her flashlight over an ancient sewing machine. I nodded, but something about the place felt off. It was too quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. We ventured deeper into the mill, our laughter and chatter fading as the oppressive atmosphere began to settle over us. "That's weird," Ethan said, pointing to a set of footprints in the dust. They were small, like a child's, and they led toward a staircase descending into the basement. "Maybe someone else was here recently," Carla suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Let's check it out," Ethan said, his adventurous spirit undeterred. The basement was pitch dark, the kind of darkness that swallows the beam of a flashlight. The air was colder here, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. As we moved cautiously through the maze of rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Did you hear that?" Carla whispered, stopping abruptly. We all froze, straining to listen. It was faint at first, like a low hum, but it grew louder, a chorus of whispers coming from somewhere ahead. We followed the sound to a large storage room. In the center of the room was an old sewing table, its surface covered in scorch marks. "What's that?" Ethan asked, pointing to a pile of fabric on the floor. As he moved closer, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Suddenly the fabric shifted, as if something beneath it was moving. "Ethan, don't!" Carla began, but it was too late. He reached out to touch it, and the moment his fingers brushed the fabric, the whispers stopped. The silence was broken by a piercing scream, not from any of us, but from the very walls of the room. The lights on our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Carla's arm and dragging her toward the door. Ethan was right behind us, but as we reached the stairs, he let out a terrified gasp. "They're coming!" he yelled, his voice cracking with fear. I turned back, and for a brief moment I saw them, shadows moving toward us, their forms twisted and unnatural. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their hands reached out, clawing at the air as if desperate to grasp something. We scrambled up the stairs, the sound of their pursuit echoing behind us. When we burst onto the main floor, the air was thick with the stench of smoke and burning fabric. The room seemed to shift before our eyes, the walls blackened with soot, and the machinery coming to life with a deafening clatter. It was as if we'd been transported back to the night of the fire. Flames licked at the walls, and the shadows of workers moved frantically, their screams blending with the roar of the blaze.
"Get out!" Carla screamed, pulling me toward the window we'd entered through. Ethan hesitated, staring at the chaos around us as if hypnotized. "Ethan, come on!" I shouted, breaking him out of his trance. We crawled through the window and tumbled onto the ground outside, gasping for air. The factory was silent once more, its facade dark and lifeless. For a moment, none of us spoke, the reality of what we'd just experienced sinking in. "What was that?" Carla finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, "but we're never going back."
The next day, I tried to make sense of it. Was it some kind of hallucination, a shared nightmare? But when I checked the footage on the camcorder, my blood ran cold. The tape showed us exploring the factory, but in the background, faint figures moved in the shadows, watching, waiting. And at the very end of the tape, as we fled the building, a single word echoed faintly: "Stay." The Sunset View Hotel had once been the pride of our small coastal town, its grand facade and luxurious rooms attracting visitors from far and wide. But decades of neglect had left it in ruins, a crumbling shell of its former glory. When my cousin Leo called to say he'd landed a job as the night watchman there, I couldn't help but laugh. "Seriously, that place is a death trap," I said, picturing the sagging roof and boarded-up windows. "It's not so bad," he replied defensively. and they're paying me good money to keep an eye on it until the renovations start. I wasn't convinced, but Leo had always been stubborn. Against my better judgment, I agreed to visit him one Friday night to keep him company during his shift. The hotel looked even worse up close. Its once grand lobby was littered with debris, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Leo greeted me with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. "Welcome to my kingdom," he said with a grin. "Yeah, real palatial," I replied, eyeing the cracked marble floors and cobwebbed chandeliers. The first few hours were uneventful. We played cards at the front desk and swapped stories to pass the time. Around midnight, Leo decided to give me a tour of the building. "This place is massive," he said, as we climbed the grand staircase. 80 rooms, a ballroom, and even a rooftop terrace. "Why hasn't it been torn down?" I asked, shining my flashlight on a faded mural of ocean waves. "Too expensive," Leo replied. "The owners figure it's cheaper to renovate than to start from scratch." As we wandered through the dark hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The shadows seemed to shift and move just beyond the reach of our flashlights, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere above. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. "Hear what?" Leo replied, looking genuinely puzzled. "Footsteps," I said. "Coming from upstairs." Leo frowned. "There's nobody else here. Trust me, I've checked every room." We continued our tour, but the unease lingered. When we reached the third floor, Leo pointed to a set of double doors at the end of the hallway. "That's the ballroom," he said. "They say it's haunted." "Why am I not surprised?" I replied, though I didn't find the idea particularly amusing. According to Leo, the ballroom was the site of a tragic accident in the 1930s. During a lavish party, the balcony overlooking the dance floor had collapsed, killing several guests. "Some people claim to hear music coming from in there late at night," Leo said, as we pushed the doors open. The room was vast and eerily quiet, its once polished floors now coated in dust. My flashlight beam swept across the space, landing on a grand piano sitting in one corner. "Creepy," I muttered, moving closer to inspect it. As I reached out to touch the keys, a sudden chill ran down my spine. "Leo, do you feel that?" I asked, turning to look at him. But he was staring at the piano, his face pale. "The keys," he whispered. "They're moving." Sure enough, the piano keys were pressing down on their own, emitting faint, discordant notes. "Let's get out of here," I said, grabbing Leo's arm. We hurried out of the ballroom, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Back in the hallway, we heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere nearby. "Okay, this isn't funny anymore," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not me," Leo replied, his own fear evident. We decided to head back to the lobby, but the moment we reached the staircase, the air seemed to change. It grew heavy and cold, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over us. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured, but its presence was suffocating. "Run," Leo whispered, and we bolted down the stairs without looking back. When we reached the lobby, the front door wouldn't budge. "It's locked," I shouted, pulling desperately at the handle. "It wasn't locked earlier," Leo replied, frantically searching for the keys. Suddenly the lights flickered, and a low, guttural voice filled the room. "Leave," it said, the single word reverberating through the air. "We're trying," I shouted, panic setting in. Just as the lights went out completely, the front door swung open on its own. We didn't hesitate, sprinting out into the night and not stopping until we reached Leo's car. As we sat there, trying to catch our breath, Leo turned to me. "I'm quitting," he said, his voice trembling. "Good idea," I replied, my hands still shaking. The next day, Leo called to tell me he'd returned the keys and resigned from the job. The hotel has since been demolished, but I'll never forget the terror we experienced that night. Some places are cursed, and the Sunset View Hotel was one of them. When I took the job as the night security guard for the old Western factory, I thought it would be an easy gig. The place was ancient, shuttered since the late 1980s, and left to decay on the outskirts of town. Rumors swirled about why it closed, ranging from financial troubles to more sinister theories involving disappearances and occult rituals. I wasn't one for superstitions. To me, it was just another paycheck. All I had to do was patrol the premises, check for trespassers, and make sure nothing burned down. On my first night, I arrived just before sunset. The factory loomed against the horizon, its jagged roofline and cracked smokestacks casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. "Just keep an eye out for kids or vagrants," my supervisor had said, "and don't go poking around the sub-basement, it's structurally unsafe." That should have been my first clue that something was off. The factory was massive, with row upon row of rusted machinery and conveyor belts coated in decades of dust. My footsteps echoed as I walked through the cavernous rooms, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. At first, it was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper, aware of every creak and groan of the building around you. I made my way to the security office, a cramped little room with a desk, a chair, and a bank of old, grainy monitors connected to cameras scattered throughout the factory. Most of the screens showed nothing but static, but a few offered glimpses of dimly lit hallways and empty storage rooms. By midnight, I'd settled into a routine, a quick patrol every hour, followed by sitting at the desk and flipping through an old paperback novel I'd brought with me. But around 2 a.m., something changed. I was watching the monitors when I noticed movement on one of the screens. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, a flicker of static that looked like a shadow moving across the hallway. But then it happened again, more distinct this time. A figure, tall and thin, walking down the hall toward one of the storage rooms. My heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be here. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the hallway, my footsteps quick but cautious. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. "This is private property. You need to leave." No response. When I reached the storage room, the door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight beam scanning the room. It was empty, at least at first glance. Then I noticed something on the floor in the center of the room. A circle drawn in what looked like ash, with strange symbols etched around its edges. I knelt down to get a closer look, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. It didn't make any sense. Who would have done this? And why? Before I could investigate further, I heard it, a low, guttural sound coming from the hallway. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a mix between a growl and a whisper. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway was empty, but the sound persisted, growing louder and closer. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, surrounding me. I backed out of the room and started toward the security office, my pulse racing. But as I rounded the corner, I froze. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a figure cloaked in shadow. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold, piercing, and utterly inhuman. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice shook. The figure tilted its head slightly as if amused by my question. And then, without warning, it began to move toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight, and turned to run. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, relentless and unnervingly steady. When I reached the security office, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The monitors flickered to life, every screen now showing the same thing, the shadowy figure standing just outside the office door. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Desperation took over, and I grabbed the landline on the desk. The line was dead, but as I held the receiver, I heard a faint voice on the other end. "They're coming," it whispered, barely audible. The lights in the office flickered, and the temperature plummeted.
A loud bang reverberated through the room as the figure began pounding on the door. Each strike felt like it was shaking the entire building, and I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, my eyes landing on a rusty pipe leaning against the wall. Gripping it tightly, I prepared for the worst. The pounding stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence.
Then the door creaked open slowly, despite the fact that I'd locked it. The figure stood in the doorway, its form shifting and writhing as if it was made of smoke and shadows. It raised an arm, pointing directly at me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. Clutching the pipe, I bolted past it and ran for the exit. The factory seemed to come alive around me, walls groaning, machinery sparking to life, and shadows darting across my path. By the time I reached the main doors, I was gasping for air. I shoved them open and stumbled out into the cold night, not stopping until I was safely in my car. I quit the job the next morning, refusing to ever set foot in that cursed place again. Later, I learned that the factory had a dark history, with rumors of occult rituals performed by the original owners. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't just a ghost, it was something far more sinister. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. My friends and I, Nate, Priya, and Alex, had been planning it for weeks, eager to escape the monotony of our lives and reconnect with nature. We chose Black Hollow Forest, a secluded stretch of wilderness known for its dense trees and serene lakes. People in town often shared stories about the forest. Some were harmless tales of hikers getting lost or spotting unusual wildlife. But others were darker, whispers of strange sightings and bone, chilling cries that echoed through the trees at night. We laughed it off. "It's just folklore," Nate had said as he packed the car. "People love to make up ghost stories about places like this." I wasn't so sure. The first day was perfect. We hiked for miles, exploring hidden trails and marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. By sunset, we had set up camp in a small clearing near a tranquil lake. The fire crackled as we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. "You guys ever hear the one about the wailing woman?" Priya asked, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. Alex groaned. "Not this again?" "No, seriously," Priya insisted. "They say she was a widow who lost her child in the forest years ago. She searched for him until she died, and now her spirit roams the woods crying for him." "That's ridiculous," Nate said, rolling his eyes. "Just a story to scare campers." I didn't say anything, but a strange unease settled in my chest. By midnight, we decided to call it a night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. I crawled into my tent, the sound of crickets lulling me to sleep. But a few hours later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The camp was silent, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. Then I heard it, a faint, mournful cry coming from the direction of the lake. I sat up, my heart pounding. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a mix of sorrow and despair that sent shivers down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Nate, who was in the tent next to mine. "What?" he mumbled sleepily. "That sound," I said. "It's coming from the lake." He groaned. "It's probably just an animal. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent and stepped into the cold night air. The sound was clearer now, a haunting wail that seemed to pierce the stillness. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward the lake. The trees loomed around me, their branches casting jagged shadows on the forest floor. As I reached the water's edge, the crying stopped abruptly. I shone my flashlight across the lake, but there was nothing there, just the calm, rippling water reflecting the moonlight. I was about to head back to camp when I noticed something in the water. At first, it looked like a piece of driftwood floating near the shore, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't wood at all. It was a figure, pale and motionless, just beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the water around it began to ripple, as if something was stirring below. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. Suddenly, the wailing resumed, louder and more anguished than before. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees and reverberating in my chest. I turned and ran, the sound chasing me back to camp. When I burst into the clearing, Nate, Priya, and Alex were already awake, their faces pale with fear. "What's going on?" Priya asked. "It's the lake," I gasped. "There's something in the water." We debated what to do, but none of us wanted to risk going back to the lake. Instead, we decided to pack up and leave at first light. The rest of the night was tense. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig set us on edge, and the wailing continued intermittently, growing fainter and then louder again. By dawn, we were exhausted but determined to leave. As we dismantled the tents, Priya froze. "Guys," she said, her voice shaking. "Look." We followed her gaze to the edge of the clearing. There, carved into the bark of a tree, was a symbol, a circle with jagged lines radiating from its center. It hadn't been there the night before. "What the hell is that?" Alex muttered, his eyes wide. "I don't know," I replied, but a deep sense of dread settled over me. We packed faster, eager to put as much distance between us and the forest as possible. The hike back to the car felt longer than it had on the way in. Every step was accompanied by the feeling of being watched, though we never saw anyone or anything around us. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear into the trunk and sped away without looking back. But even as we drove, the unease lingered. Priya turned to me, her face pale. "Do you think it'll follow us?" she asked. I didn't have an answer. That night I couldn't sleep. The wailing echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the image of the figure beneath the water. A few days later, I decided to do some research on Black Hollow Forest. What I found chilled me to the bone. The symbol we'd seen on the tree was linked to an old legend about a coven of witches that had once used the forest for their rituals. According to the stories, they had summoned something dark, something that still lingered in the woods, feeding on fear and sorrow. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I do know this. I'll never set foot in Black Hollow Forest again. Some places are meant to be left alone, their secrets buried in the shadows, and some cries should never be answered. The neon open sign flickered outside the diner as I wiped down the counter for the third time that night. Midnight shifts at Maple Creek Diner were usually quiet, save for the occasional trucker or insomniac stopping by for coffee and pie. The silence wasn't always comforting. The diner sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, and on slow nights, the vast emptiness outside felt oppressive. It was 2:17 a.m. when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, expecting a weary traveler, but instead a man stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He was tall and wiry, wearing a weathered coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about him set me on edge. "Coffee?" I asked, forcing a smile. He nodded but didn't speak. I poured him a cup and placed it on the counter. "Anything else?" I asked, trying to read his expression beneath the shadow of his cap. He shook his head and sat at the far end of the counter, his hands wrapped tightly around the mug. I went back to cleaning, keeping an eye on him out of the corner of my eye. Minutes passed, and he didn't move, didn't drink the coffee, just stared at the wall like he was waiting for something. The unease grew, but I tried to shake it off. I'd dealt with strange customers before, loners and drifters who passed through town in the dead of night. But this felt different. I decided to distract myself by organizing the shelves in the back room. It was only a few steps away from the counter, and I could still hear if anyone called out. As I stacked cans, a soft sound reached my ears, a faint tapping like someone drumming their fingers on the counter. I peered through the doorway, but the man was gone. The coffee cup sat untouched on the counter, steam still rising from it. "Hello!" I called out, stepping back into the dining area. There was no response. The diner was empty, the only sound, the hum of the refrigerator. I walked to the door, expecting to see the man heading toward the highway, but the parking lot was deserted. I locked the door, my unease turning into dread. As I turned back toward the counter, the lights flickered, casting the diner into brief, stuttering darkness. When the light stabilized, I froze. The coffee cup was gone. In its place was a piece of paper folded neatly. With trembling hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "He's coming." My breath hitched, and I looked around, my heart racing. "Who's coming?" I whispered to myself, the paper crumpling in my grip. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. I grabbed my flashlight from beneath the counter and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The diner felt different now, smaller, like the walls were closing in. The faint tapping sound returned, louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from the counter this time, but from the window at the far end of the diner. I turned the flashlight toward it, my stomach churning. A face stared back at me, pale and distorted, pressed against the glass. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. I screamed, dropping the flashlight, and when I looked up again, the face was gone. My instincts told me to leave, but the thought of stepping outside into the pitch, black night was even more terrifying. I grabbed the landline phone and dialed 911, but the line was dead. A loud bang echoed through the diner, coming from the kitchen. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting toward the swinging door that led to the back. Another bang, louder this time, like something heavy being thrown against the wall.
"Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. There was no answer, just the sound of shuffling footsteps moving closer. The door creaked open slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something hunched and unnatural, a figure with elongated limbs and claws that scraped against the tile floor. I bolted toward the front door, fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get it open.
I ran out into the parking lot, the cold night air biting at my skin. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, and I sprinted toward it, glancing over my shoulder as I ran. The diner's windows were dark, but I could feel something watching me. When I reached my car, I yanked the door open and jumped inside, locking it behind me. As I fumbled for the keys, a shadow moved across the rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look. The pale, grinning face was pressed against the back window, its black eyes staring directly at me. I screamed, dropping the keys, and scrambled to pick them up. The figure slammed its hand against the glass, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the car, flooring the gas pedal without looking back. The highway was deserted as I sped toward town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the police station. When I told the officers what had happened, they looked at me like I was crazy. One of them drove back to the diner with me to investigate, but when we arrived, everything was normal. The lights were on, the coffee cup was back on the counter, and there was no sign of the note or the creature. The officer shrugged, clearly unimpressed. "Probably just a prank," he said. "Kids messing around?" But I knew better. I quit my job the next day, unwilling to spend another night in that diner. Sometimes, when I drive past it late at night, I see the neon sign flickering and wonder if anyone else has encountered what I did. It was my first day working the night shift at Holloway Steelworks. The factory had been a cornerstone of the town for decades, but over the years it had fallen into disrepair. Most people avoided it unless they were desperate for work, and I guess that's what I was, desperate. The day shift workers were clocking out as I arrived. They looked exhausted, their faces drawn and pale. One of them, a wiry man with greying hair, caught my arm as I passed. "Be careful in there," he muttered. "This place, it's not right after dark." I laughed nervously, assuming he was joking, but his expression didn't change. "What do you mean?" I asked. He glanced around as if afraid someone might hear him. "Just keep your head down and don't wander off. Trust me." Before I could press him further, he let go of my arm and disappeared into the parking lot. Inside, the factory was a maze of towering machinery and dimly lit corridors. The hum of the machines was almost deafening, and the air was thick with the smell of oil and metal. My supervisor, Carl, was a gruff man with a permanent scowl. He handed me a clipboard and pointed me toward the assembly line. "Keep an eye on the conveyor belt," he said. "Make sure nothing jams. Got it?" I nodded, though I barely understood what he was saying over the noise. The first few hours were uneventful. The factory was massive, but the night shift crew was small. Just me, Carl, and two other workers, Beth and Marcus. Beth was friendly enough, but Marcus barely spoke, his eyes constantly darting around like he was expecting something to jump out at him. "Does it always feel this oppressive in here?" I asked Beth during a brief break. She hesitated, then shrugged. "You get used to it," she said, but her tone was far from convincing. Around midnight, things started to change. The hum of the machines seemed to grow louder, almost like a low growl reverberating through the factory. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then the lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. "What's going on?" I asked Carl, who was inspecting one of the machines. "Power grid's old," he replied gruffly. "It happens. Keep working." But the unease in the air was palpable. As I returned to my station, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the machines. I turned, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was nothing there. "Just my nerves," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by the machines. "Did you hear that?" I asked Marcus, who was working nearby. He froze, his face pale. "Hear what?" "Whispering," I said. "It's probably just the machines, right?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving me alone. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but when I turned off the machine closest to me to listen, it stopped. By 2 a.m., the tension in the factory was unbearable. Beth came over to my station, her face drawn with worry. "Did you see Marcus?" she asked. "No," I replied. "Why?" "He's gone," she said. "I can't find him anywhere." We searched the factory together, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Carl was furious when we told him. "Probably snuck out for a smoke," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. We returned to our stations, but my nerves were shot. The whispering had started again, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from all around me. I tried to focus on the conveyor belt, but then the lights flickered again, and this time they went out completely. The hum of the machine stopped, plunging the factory into an eerie silence. "Beth?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward her station, but she wasn't there. The whispering had turned into a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw something, a figure hunched in the shadows, its eyes glowing like embers. I froze, unable to move as it turned toward me. The figure was unlike anything I'd ever seen, tall and gaunt, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was a twisted mask of malice, and its mouth opened in a soundless scream. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen wrench, and scrambled to my feet. The creature didn't move, but its eyes followed me as I backed away. "Carl!" I screamed, running toward the supervisor's office. The office was empty. The growling grew louder, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was alone. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against it as my mind raced. What was that thing, and where was everyone else? I grabbed the landline phone on Carl's desk, but it was dead. Then I noticed something scrawled on the wall in what looked like grease. "You should have left." Panic set in, and I began searching the office for anything I could use to defend myself. The only thing I found was a rusty crowbar, but it was better than nothing. As I stepped back into the factory, the lights flickered on and off, illuminating the twisted machinery and casting grotesque shadows. The whispering had returned, louder than ever, and it seemed to be calling my name. I followed the sound, unable to stop myself, as if I were being drawn toward it. The factory seemed to shift around me, the corridors stretching endlessly. Finally, I reached the heart of the factory, a massive chamber filled with machinery that looked ancient and otherworldly. In the center stood the creature, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Behind it, I saw Marcus and Beth, standing motionless, their faces blank and expressionless. "Let them go!" I shouted, gripping the crowbar tightly. The creature tilted its head, its twisted smile widening. "You don't belong here," it rasped, its voice a chorus of whispers. Before I could respond, it lunged toward me, moving faster than I thought possible. I swung the crowbar wildly, but it passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. The creature laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. "You can't fight what you don't understand," it said. Suddenly, the lights blazed brightly, blinding me. When I opened my eyes, I was outside the factory, lying on the cold pavement. The building was silent, its windows dark. I staggered to my feet, my mind reeling. The next morning, I went to the police, but they found no evidence of Beth, Marcus, or even Carl. It was as if they had never existed. The factory was shut down a week later, deemed unsafe for operation. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling my name, calling. It was the kind of hotel where you could smell the years it had weathered, a faint, musty odor that clung to the walls no matter how much they scrubbed or painted. The Crescent Arms Hotel had once been a jewel in the city's skyline, but those days were long gone. Now it was a relic of another era, kept alive by travelers who didn't mind peeling wallpaper and ancient furniture. I was one of those travelers. It was late when I checked in, exhausted after a 9-hour drive. The clerk at the front desk, a tired-looking woman named Sheila, handed me a tarnished brass key with the number 617 etched into it. "Top floor," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Take the elevator." The elevator was as old as the hotel itself, with creaky cables and a rickety gate that groaned in protest as it slid shut. As it ascended, the light above the floor numbers flickered erratically. By the time I reached the 6th floor, it was completely out, leaving me in near darkness. The hallway was long and eerily quiet, the carpet threadbare in places. My room was at the far end, and as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Something about the number 617 sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. The room was no better than I'd expected, dimly lit, with a single bed, a faded armchair, and a bulky old TV on a wooden stand. But it was the mirror that caught my attention. It hung on the wall opposite the bed, larger than any hotel mirror I'd ever seen, with an ornate gold frame that seemed out of place in such a run-down room. As I set my bag down, I noticed the mirror's surface was smudged, as if someone had pressed their hand against it recently. Strange, I thought. I tried to ignore the unease that settled over me as I unpacked my things. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed, intending to get a good night's sleep before continuing my journey. But sleep didn't come easily. The room was too quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the old building sound amplified. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, but when I turned toward the sound, I realized it was coming from the mirror. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. Slowly, I got out of bed and approached the mirror. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop myself. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I saw something, movement in the reflection. It was subtle at first, like a shadow shifting just out of sight. But as I stared, the reflection began to change. The room in the mirror was no longer empty. There was someone standing behind me, a figure cloaked in darkness, its features obscured. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and called the front desk. "This is Sheila," the clerk answered, her voice tired.
I think there's something wrong with my room," I stammered. "The mirror?" Sheila cut me off. "What room are you in?" 614. There was a long pause. "You need to leave, now." Her urgency sent a jolt of fear through me. "What's going on?" I demanded. "I don't have time to explain," she said. "Just grab your things and get out of that room."
Before I could respond, the line went dead. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw my clothes into my bag and headed for the door. But when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I yanked on the handle, but it was as if the door had been bolted from the outside. Behind me, the mirror began to rattle, the glass vibrating as if it were under immense pressure. I turned just in time to see the surface ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. And then the figure was back, closer this time, its face still hidden, but its intent unmistakable. It raised a hand, and I swear I felt it brush against my shoulder. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the door. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the wood. The mirror's surface began to crack, thin lines spiderwebbing across the glass. The figure moved closer, and for the first time, I saw its eyes, two hollow voids that seemed to pull the light out of the room. The crack spread faster, and with a deafening shatter, the mirror exploded. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the hallway floor outside room 6117. The door was ajar, and the room beyond was completely empty. My bag was gone, as was any sign that I had ever been there. I staggered to my feet and made my way down to the lobby, where Sheila was waiting. "You're lucky," she said, her face pale. "Not everyone makes it out of that room." She told me the story as I sat in the lobby, trembling. Years ago, a man had died in room 617 under mysterious circumstances. Since then, every guest who stayed there reported strange occurrences, whispering, shadows, even apparitions. The hotel had tried to close the room off, but somehow it always found its way back into circulation. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Sheila looked away, guilt flickering across her face. "I tried," she said. "But the room, it has a way of drawing people in." I left the Crescent Arms Hotel that night and never looked back. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I swear I see something, a shadow lingering just behind me, waiting. The hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound in the empty warehouse. I had taken the night shift at an old distribution center just outside of town. It was dull work, scanning boxes and keeping an eye on security monitors, but the pay was decent and I needed the money. My name is Eric, and this was supposed to be an easy job, until the night I realized I wasn't alone. The warehouse was massive, with rows upon rows of shelves stretching into the darkness. At night, the place felt like a labyrinth, every shadow and flicker of light playing tricks on my eyes. I had been working there for a few months without incident, but something about that night felt off. It started with small things, missing tools, strange noises, and the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I was at my station, going through the motions of logging inventory, when the sound of footsteps echoed through the aisles. I paused, my hand hovering over the keyboard. No one else was supposed to be here. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the eerie silence. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped away from my desk, the beam cutting through the darkness as I moved toward the sound. As I walked, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a rat, maybe, or the building settling. But deep down, I knew better. When I reached the far end of the warehouse, I found nothing out of the ordinary. Just rows of boxes stacked neatly on the shelves. But as I turned to head back, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the shelves. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. There was no response. I shone my flashlight toward where I had seen the movement, but the beam revealed nothing but empty aisles. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I quickened my pace, heading back to the safety of my desk. But when I got there, I froze. The monitors, which displayed security feeds from around the warehouse, were all flickering. One by one, the cameras went dark, until only one feed remained. It showed the aisle I had just come from, and in the grainy black and white footage, I saw it, a figure standing perfectly still, just beyond the edge of the camera's view. My stomach dropped as the figure turned slowly toward the lens. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face, it didn't have one. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over my chair as the feed cut to static. For a moment, I thought about running, grabbing my keys and leaving without looking back. But my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what I was dealing with. I grabbed a metal rod from the supply closet and headed back toward the aisle. My flashlight flickered as I walked, the light dimming and brightening erratically. When I reached the aisle, it was empty. But something was different. The air felt heavy and the temperature had dropped significantly. And then I saw it, a single box pulled from the shelf and sitting in the middle of the floor. Cautiously, I approached the box. It was old, covered in dust, with no labels or markings to indicate what was inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. Then, gathering my courage, I opened it. Inside was a collection of photographs, all black and white and worn with age. They showed the warehouse, but not as I knew it. In the photos, the shelves were empty, the walls crumbling, and the place looked abandoned. And in each picture, there was the figure, the same faceless entity I had seen on the monitor. Sometimes it was in the background, barely visible. Other times, it was front and center, as if posing for the camera. But the last photo stopped me cold. It was of me, sitting at my desk. The image was recent, the ink still wet. I dropped the photo and stepped back, my heart pounding. That's when I heard it, the footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned, raising the metal rod, but there was no one there. Only the sound of breathing, soft and ragged, just inches away. I swung the rod wildly, the adrenaline coursing through me. The air seemed to ripple, as if something unseen was moving around me. I ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. The aisles blurred together, the rows of shelves stretching endlessly. And then I saw it, the emergency exit, illuminated by a single flickering light. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps growing louder, faster. When I reached the door, I slammed into it, pushing it open with all my strength. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I stumbled out into the parking lot. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I turned back toward the warehouse. In the window of the break room, I saw it, the figure standing perfectly still watching me. It didn't move, didn't follow. It just stood there, its faceless head tilted slightly, as if daring me to come back. I didn't. I quit the next day, leaving without explaining myself to my boss or co-workers. Sometimes late at night, I still think about the warehouse, about the figure and the photos, and I wonder, was it warning me? Or was it just playing with me? I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure I want them. But one thing's for sure, I'll never take another night shift again. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a quiet weekend in the woods, far from the noise of the city. My friends and I had planned this for months. We rented a cabin in a remote area, nestled deep in the forest, away from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just nature, friends, and a chance to relax. The cabin itself was charming, built in a rustic style with wooden beams and a stone fireplace. It was an old place, but well kept, with an unmistakable sense of history in its walls. It was a bit off the beaten path, but that only added to the charm. We could already feel the stress of our busy lives slipping away as we arrived and settled in. My name is Tom, and this is the story of the weekend that changed everything for us. The first night was peaceful. We spent hours around the fire, telling stories, laughing, and enjoying the serenity of the woods. But as the fire crackled and the shadows stretched long into the night, there was something strange about the silence that surrounded us. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet you expect in nature. There was an unnatural stillness, as if even the wind had decided to take a break. "I swear I heard something," said my friend Kyle, breaking the silence. We all turned to him. He was sitting with his back to the dark woods, staring into the fire. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "What did you hear?" "Like footsteps, really faint, like someone was walking around outside," he said. "But it stopped as soon as I turned around." We all laughed it off. It was the middle of nowhere after all. What could possibly be out there? But the atmosphere had shifted slightly. A sense of unease lingered in the air, even though we all tried to ignore it. The next morning, we woke up to clear skies and the smell of pine and fresh earth. The world outside our cabin was bright, beautiful, and alive. We went on a long hike through the woods, and for a while it seemed like the strange feeling from the night before had faded. That afternoon, we decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that led deeper into the forest, and we figured we'd check it out. It wasn't marked on any maps, but we were curious. The further we went, the quieter the woods became. The birds, which had been singing earlier, fell silent, and the only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional rustling of trees. We walked for about an hour, the trail winding deeper into the woods. Then, just when we were starting to think we should turn back, we saw it. Another cabin. It was old, abandoned, and barely visible through the thick trees. We weren't sure how we had missed it earlier. There was something off about it, an unnatural stillness, just like the night before. But curiosity got the better of us. "Let's check it out," Kyle said, always the adventurous one. We approached cautiously, the door hanging ajar. The wood of the cabin looked rotted, and the windows were cracked, but there was something compelling about it. It didn't seem like it had been abandoned for too long. It felt recent. We pushed open the door, which creaked loudly as it swung inward. The air inside was stale and musty, the smell of damp wood filling our nostrils. But the strangest part was the silence. No sign of animals, no wind, just absolute quiet. It was almost like the cabin was frozen in time. Inside, the room was empty except for a few pieces of old furniture. A table in the corner, a couple of chairs, and an old, dusty bed frame with no mattress. But there was one odd detail, a photo frame on the table with a picture of the very cabin we had come from, the one we had rented. It was a picture of the front porch, the same one we had been sitting on the night before. But there was something wrong with it. In the picture, we saw ourselves, all 5 of us sitting on the porch, exactly as we had been the night before. But the photo was taken from an angle that no one had been standing at. And the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. The faces in the photo were all wrong, distorted, almost as if they were fading. "Who took this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No one," Kyle replied, his face pale. "We were all inside last night. No one took this picture." I turned to look at the others, and they all had the same confused expression on their faces. "Let's go back," said Emily, one of our other friends. Her voice was shaking now. She was the first to move toward the door. But just as we reached the door, something else caught my eye, a piece of paper wedged between the floorboards. I knelt down and pulled it free. It was a note written in a hurried scrawl. "You can never leave." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, holding the paper out for everyone to see. "That's it," Kyle said, his voice filled with a mix of fear and frustration. "We need to get out of here, now." We didn't need to be told twice. We turned to leave, but as we stepped out of the cabin, something happened. The world seemed to shift. The trees no longer looked familiar. The trail we had followed seemed to have vanished, and the air felt wrong. It was as if we had walked into a different part of the forest, one that wasn't supposed to exist. We ran, all of us, trying to retrace our steps, but the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The once clear path was now lost, and we found ourselves turning in circles. We couldn't escape. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. We were cold, exhausted, and terrified. It felt like we were being watched from every direction, as if something was waiting for us to make a mistake. Finally, we stumbled upon the familiar clearing, the one with the cabin we had rented. But when we reached the door, we stopped dead in our tracks. The cabin was gone. It wasn't just empty, it was as if it had never been there at all. The spot where we had left it was now just an empty clearing, the earth undisturbed. There were no footprints, no sign of our presence. We spent the rest of the night in a panic, trying to find the road, trying to get out of the woods. But it was as if the forest itself was keeping us trapped. The next morning, when we finally stumbled back into town, we were half crazed with fear. But when we tried to tell the locals what had happened, no one believed us. The cabin was gone. No one had ever heard of it. To this day, I'm not sure what happened that weekend. All I know is that we weren't supposed to find that cabin. And once we did, there was no way out. I had always loved the woods. Growing up, I spent most of my summers exploring the forests near my home, climbing trees, tracking animals, and feeling like I was part of something ancient. The woods were peaceful, quiet, and full of life. I never felt scared, no matter how deep into the forest I ventured. But that was before I learned what lurked in the shadows. My name is Jake, and this is the story of the warning I ignored. It's a lesson I'll never forget. It started as a routine camping trip with my buddies, a group of us, just like the good old days. We rented a cabin on the edge of a dense forest miles away from the nearest town. The cabin was small but comfortable, with a wood, burning stove and a large porch where we could relax at night, far from the distractions of modern life. We arrived early in the afternoon, and after unloading our gear, we set up camp in the clearing behind the cabin. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and everything seemed perfect. We made a fire, grilled some food, and settled in for the evening. As night fell, we sat around the fire, talking and laughing, enjoying each other's company. But as the evening wore on, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just an odd sensation, like the forest was watching us. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the wind had died down. The night air felt unnaturally still. I brushed it off as nothing, just my imagination, or maybe the unfamiliarity of being so deep in the woods. Around midnight, we decided to go for a short walk. The moon was full, casting a silvery light over the landscape. It was the kind of night that felt magical, like something out of a fairy tale. But as we walked deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The trees, which had seemed inviting and friendly before, now felt oppressive and looming. "Hey guys," my friend Mark said, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. "I don't know about you, but I feel like we're being watched." I laughed, trying to ease the tension. "Come on, Mark, it's just the woods. You're probably just spooked by the dark." But as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, observing us, waiting for something. We continued walking, trying to shrug off the unease. But then we heard it, the faint sound of something moving through the underbrush. It was soft at first, like a rustle of leaves, but as we stopped and listened, it grew louder, almost rhythmic. "Do you guys hear that?" I whispered. Everyone fell silent, straining to listen. The rustling stopped, only to be replaced by a low growl, distant but distinct. "What the hell was that?" Tom, another one of our friends, asked, his voice shaking slightly. We all exchanged uneasy glances. We had been hearing strange noises in the woods all night, but this was different. It was low, menacing, and definitely not the sound of any animal we recognized. "Let's head back," I suggested, trying to sound confident, even though my heart was racing. But as we turned to make our way back to the cabin, we noticed something strange. There was no path. The trees seemed to have closed in around us, and the clearing we had walked from was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the forest had shifted, trapping us in its depths. Panic started to creep in. We had only walked a few hundred yards from the cabin, but now we had no idea where we were. We tried to retrace our steps, but everything looked the same: dense trees, thick underbrush, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. "What the hell is going on?" Mark said, his voice rising in panic. "Calm down," I said, trying to keep my cool. "We'll find the cabin. Just stay together." But the forest had other plans. The deeper we went, the darker it became, the shadows growing thicker with each passing minute. The moonlight barely filtered through the canopy above, and the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. "Guys, I don't think we're alone," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned to look at him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I followed his gaze into the dark woods. There, in the distance, I thought I saw something moving. A figure, tall and unnatural, standing between the trees. It was hard to make out, but its outline was unmistakable. It wasn't human. "Run!" I yelled, turning on my heel and bolting back the way we came. The others followed, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around us. We ran and ran, our footsteps pounding the ground, but no matter how fast we went, we couldn't seem to get any closer to the cabin. The shadows shifted, and the growl from earlier echoed in the distance, growing louder and more menacing. And then, just as I thought we were about to collapse from exhaustion, we found it, the cabin. But it wasn't the cabin we had rented. This one was different. It was older, the wood dark and weathered, and the door was slightly ajar. We stumbled inside, slamming the door behind us, our hearts racing. We sat there in the dark, trying to catch our breath, the fear still gripping us. "What the hell was that?" Mark said, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. "But I think we've made a mistake. We shouldn't have come here." The rest of the night passed in a blur. We huddled in the cabin, trying to stay quiet, but the sounds outside were relentless. Growls, rustlings, and the distant cracking of branches. Whatever was out there, it was waiting for us. When morning finally came, we were exhausted and terrified. We managed to leave the cabin, but the forest still felt wrong, twisted and alive in a way I couldn't explain. The path back to our car was easier to find now, but something about the place stayed with me, a deep sense of dread that wouldn't go away. We left the forest behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in those woods was still following us, watching us from the shadows. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in those woods. Some say it was a warning, something that protects the forest from those who don't belong. Others believe it was something far darker, a creature that only comes out at night to hunt. All I know is this: I will never ignore the warning of the forest again. I've always been a night owl. While most people cherish the peace and quiet of early mornings, I found comfort in the stillness of the night. It was the perfect time for reflection, solitude, and, if I was lucky, a clear view of the stars. But this particular night was different. This was a night I would never forget. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of the night I learned the hard way that sometimes the silence isn't just peaceful, it's terrifying. It all started innocently enough. I had taken a weekend trip to an old house in the countryside. It was one of those places that felt as though it had stories to tell. Faded walls, creaky floorboards, and an overgrown garden. It was perfect for a retreat, away from the noise of the city, to unwind and focus on writing. I had rented the place from an online listing, one that promised peace and tranquility. The house was secluded, sitting at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by thick woods. The nearest town was miles away, and it had the kind of quiet that made it feel like I had the whole world to myself. It was a dream setting for a writer who was struggling with inspiration. The first couple of nights were fine. I spent my days writing in the cozy living room by the fireplace, and at night I would sit outside on the porch, enjoying the cool air and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, too peaceful. There were no cars, no traffic lights, not even a distant hum of civilization, just the quiet hum of nature. But that changed on the fourth night. It started around midnight. I had just finished my writing for the day and was preparing to head to bed when I noticed something odd. From my perch on the porch, I could see the outline of the forest surrounding the house. It was a familiar sight by now, but tonight, something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was an unusual stillness in the air. The trees weren't swaying, and the usual chirping of crickets was absent. The silence was so deep, it felt like the world had stopped. My instincts told me something was wrong, but I couldn't tell what. I shook it off, convinced that my imagination was playing tricks on me, and went inside. As I climbed the stairs to the second floor, I heard something that made me pause. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. But the sound was unmistakable. It was the creak of boots on the floorboards, the kind of sound you make when you're walking on wooden floors late at night. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps seemed to be coming from below, from the living room, but they weren't hurried or erratic. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing around. I stood motionless at the top of the stairs, waiting to hear if they would stop. But they didn't. My mind raced. Could it be the landlord? He had mentioned he would be stopping by to check on the place, but why would he be here this late? I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand, my pulse quickening. As I descended the stairs, I strained to hear any more sounds, but everything was silent. The footsteps had stopped. I reached the living room and switched on the light, only to find the room completely empty. No one was there. Confused, I searched the house from top to bottom. I checked every room, every closet, but there was no sign of anyone. The house was as empty as it had been when I arrived. My heart was still racing as I returned to the living room and sat down, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the solitude was getting to me. I decided to try and go back to sleep, but as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing noises from downstairs, but whenever I checked, everything was silent. It was like someone or something was watching me. The next few hours dragged on in a blur of anxiety. I kept hearing strange sounds, scratching at the windows, faint whispers in the distance, and that same slow, deliberate pacing that kept me from fully relaxing. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I fell into a restless sleep. The following morning, I woke up feeling unsettled. I had spent the entire night trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but I knew, deep down, something wasn't right. I checked the front and back doors, making sure they were locked, but everything seemed normal. Too normal. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I went for a walk through the woods, hoping the fresh air would clear my head, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods were eerily still, not a single bird singing or leaf rustling. It felt wrong. I returned to the house by dusk, deciding to call it a day and stay inside for the night. But as night fell, the same unease settled over me. I sat in the living room, the fireplace crackling as I tried to focus on a book. But every now and then, I would glance up at the windows, expecting to see someone, standing just outside, watching me. Then it happened again, the slow footsteps, but this time, they were closer, right outside the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare move, I couldn't. The footsteps moved slowly along the porch, as if someone was walking around the house, deliberately avoiding the light. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the landlord, but the signal was weak out here. I couldn't get a clear connection. My mind raced. Should I go check outside? Should I confront whoever was out there? But before I could decide, I heard something else. A low, rumbling growl just beneath the sound of the footsteps. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a wolf. It was deep, guttural, and somehow wrong. I ran to the window, my heart in my throat, but when I peered outside, the yard was empty. No one was there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother to check out properly. I just wanted to get out of there, away from that house, away from whatever had been watching me. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house was still there, standing silent in the distance, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never return. Some places, I've learned, have a way of keeping secrets, and some things are better left unknown. My name is Lucas, and this is the story of the terrifying encounter I had in the middle of the woods, a place that was supposed to be peaceful. It's been years, but the fear still lingers. I have trouble even walking through forests now, even with the sun shining down brightly. This story begins on an ordinary camping trip, one that I thought would be nothing more than a weekend getaway. Little did I know that this trip would change my life forever. It was supposed to be a break from the usual stress of everyday life. I was tired of work, tired of noise, tired of people. So I decided to pack my bags and head to the woods, just me, a tent, and the wilderness. I found a spot deep in the woods, far from the nearest road or trail. It was the kind of place where you could truly be alone, where the only sounds you'd hear were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. It felt like paradise. The first day was perfect. The air was fresh, the sky clear, and I spent the day exploring the forest. I even set up a small campfire and roasted marshmallows as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was everything I'd hoped for: quiet, peaceful, isolated. As night fell, I settled into my tent and fell asleep to the soothing sounds of the forest. But around midnight, something woke me up. It wasn't a noise, it was more like a feeling. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deep in my bones. I lay still, staring into the dark, listening for anything that might explain the feeling. Then I heard it, a soft rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon rummaging through the forest. But the rustling was too close, too deliberate. I sat up, heart racing. I wasn't alone. I held my breath, hoping that whatever it was would move on. But then I heard something else, a low, guttural growl. It was not the sound of any animal I knew. It was deep, unnatural, and full of malice. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened, and I could only listen in terror. I slowly grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling. I flicked it on and zipped open the tent door just enough to peek outside. My eyes scanned the area, but I saw nothing. The woods were still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing stirred. Confused and frightened, I decided to stay inside the tent, thinking maybe I had imagined it all. But as I lay back down, I noticed something chilling, a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but they were unmistakable. The eyes shone in the moonlight, reflecting like the eyes of an animal, but they were too large, too unnatural. I froze, unable to move or breathe. The eyes blinked slowly, never leaving my gaze. For what felt like hours, I lay there, unable to look away. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the eyes disappeared into the dark. I stayed awake the rest of the night, heart pounding, waiting for the sun to rise. When daylight finally broke through the trees, I packed my things in a hurry and left the camp. I didn't want to stay another minute in that place. As I walked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I was being watched. I didn't even stop to look around or take in the beauty of the forest. I just wanted to get out of there, far away from whatever had been watching me the night before. It wasn't until I got back home that I realized something was truly wrong. The further I got from the woods, the more the memory of those eyes haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting for me. And in the weeks that followed, I began to experience things I couldn't explain. I would wake up at night with the sense that someone was in the room with me. I would hear footsteps in the hallway, but when I checked, no one was there. Shadows would flicker at the edges of my vision, and I would feel eyes on me even when I was alone. It became worse over time. The fear grew, and I became paranoid. Every night, I would check all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked, even though I knew no one could get in. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I couldn't stop the sense of being watched. A month later, I returned to the woods with a group of friends. They didn't know about what had happened to me. They thought I was just being paranoid, and I didn't want to worry them, so I didn't tell them what had happened. We set up camp near the same spot, thinking it would be a fun, normal trip. But as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us again. The same strange unease crept into my bones, and I began to feel that same sense of dread. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I saw it again, the pair of glowing eyes in the woods, just beyond the firelight. They were watching us just like the last time. This time, I wasn't alone in seeing them. My friend Matt noticed them too, and his face went pale when he realized what he was looking at. We tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't feel right. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was about to happen. Then the growling started again. That deep, unnatural growl echoed through the woods, sending chills down my spine. It was closer this time, much closer. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The eyes were moving, slowly, getting closer to the camp. We all stood frozen, staring into the darkness. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like we were trapped, like the forest itself had closed in around us. Suddenly Matt screamed. I turned to to see him pointing toward the trees, his face twisted in fear. I looked where he was pointing, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, hulking, and covered in dark fur, stood at the edge of the woods. Its eyes glowed with an eerie intensity, fixed on us. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It had the build of a man, but the shape was wrong. Its limbs were too long, and its posture was too unnatural. It moved toward us, its heavy steps thudding on the ground with each movement. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We grabbed our things and ran, leaving our camp behind as we sprinted toward the cars. We could hear the creature's growls getting louder, closer, but none of us dared to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hours away. We never went back to the woods. No one ever spoke of it again, but I know we all feel the same way. Those eyes, that figure, it wasn't human, and it wasn't a bear or wolf. It was something else, something that belongs in the darkness. My name is Aaron, and what I'm about to tell you is not a story of fantasy or imagination. This happened to me, and it still haunts me to this day. This is the story of how I came face to face with something I couldn't explain, a creature that followed me for days, silent, but always watching. It all started during a long road trip through the Appalachian Mountains. I had been planning the trip for months, looking forward to the solitude of the mountains and the chance to clear my mind. Life had been stressful, and I needed some time to get away, to think things through. I decided to drive through the mountains, camping along the way. I picked a small, quiet campsite nestled between two tall ridgelines. The spot seemed perfect, secluded, with no other campers nearby. I set up my tent and campfire, cooking a simple meal as the sun set behind the trees. It was the kind of peace I had been craving. As the darkness descended, the forest around me seemed to come alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. The stars above were like diamonds in a velvet sky, and I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I sat by the fire, reading a book, until I began to feel an odd sensation. It was subtle at first, just a feeling like I wasn't entirely alone. At first, I brushed it off as just nerves. The woods can feel a little intimidating at night, and it's easy to let your imagination get the best of you. But then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something off. I couldn't see anything, but I felt eyes on me. I stood up and looked around, scanning the dark forest beyond the firelight. There was nothing there, just the dark, still trees swaying in the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to head to my tent and get some sleep, telling myself that I was being paranoid. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to relax, but every creak and rustle of the wind made me tense up. I couldn't sleep, not with that unsettling feeling gnawing at me. It wasn't until hours later, when I thought I was finally drifting off, that I heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep. The sound of something moving around my campsite. I lay frozen in my tent, heart racing. The footsteps were slow, calculated, like whatever was out there was taking its time, circling the camp. I didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest noise would give me away. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would leave. But instead, I heard something else. A low, guttural sound, almost like a hum, but deeper, more resonant, as if it was coming from the very earth itself. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a crack, peering out into the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure, tall, thin, and cloaked in shadows, was standing just beyond the circle of light cast by my campfire. Its face was hidden, but I could see its silhouette clearly enough. The figure was completely still, not moving an inch. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely. I didn't know what to do. I thought about grabbing my things and running, but something told me that would only make it worse. Instead, I slowly closed the tent zipper and tried to calm my breathing. I had to stay calm. I couldn't let fear take control. The minutes felt like hours, and still the figure didn't move. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the dark outline, but eventually the figure seemed to disappear back into the woods. The strange hum faded with it, and the forest returned to its usual sounds. But I wasn't fooling myself. I knew something was out there, and it wasn't going to leave me alone. The next morning, I packed up my campsite in a hurry, not wanting to stick around longer than necessary. I left the spot behind and decided to drive farther up the mountain, hoping that a change of scenery would ease my mind. But no matter where I went, that feeling stayed with me. It was as if the woods were following me, the eyes of something unseen, always watching. Every time I stopped, every time I set up camp, the feeling returned. The footsteps, the hum, the figure in the shadows. I decided to push on, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the nights grew more restless. I would hear the sounds more clearly now, footsteps closer, the hum louder, until it felt like something was breathing just outside my tent. Every time I looked, there was nothing. Just shadows. It was on the third night that things took a more dangerous turn. I had camped near a cliffside, hoping to get some beautiful sunrise photos. I thought the views would be worth the risk of being out in the open. But that night, the air was different. It felt charged, as if the very atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. I had just finished eating dinner when I heard the familiar sound, the soft thudding of footsteps. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound, determined to confront whatever was out there. The darkness swallowed everything around me, but the light from the flashlight pierced through the trees. I followed the sound of the footsteps, but I couldn't see anything, not at first. Then I heard it again, the hum, now louder, vibrating in my chest. It was close. I felt it, and then I saw it. The figure, but this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward me. I froze in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure's outline became clearer, and I could see the shape of its body, its long, thin arms hanging at its sides. It wasn't human. There was no way it could be. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and then it stopped. The figure's head turned slowly, impossibly, until its glowing eyes met mine. The sensation of being watched intensified, suffocating, like I was the prey and it was the predator. I didn't hesitate this time. I ran, pushing through the trees, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear the creature following, its footsteps getting closer. The hum was deafening now, and I was certain it was gaining on me. I don't remember how long I ran, or how I got back to my car, but I do remember the moment I reached the vehicle. I slammed the door shut and locked it, breathless, drenched in sweat. I started the engine and didn't look back. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, just needing to be away from the woods. I haven't been back to those mountains since that night. To this day, I don't know what I encountered out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone, and whatever it was watching me.